In the economics department, how do we justify the presuppositions of economics? Private property? How can that be justified? Again, that assumes some kind of moral concept and also some view of the relationship between an individual biological form called a human being and a plot of ground or a car or what have you. How can the economics department account in a materialistic framework of thought, account for what we call private property? How can the economics department avoid the threat of statism, where if you have no moral basis to protect private property, you cannot keep the state from intruding so far as to control all the property? Our studies in environmental matters are distressed in our day as well. We are told often by environmentalists in our university communities that men should not abuse animals. By the way, as a Christian, I agree with that, but I have a reason for saying they should not abuse animals. What I want to know is, if you take a non-Christian approach to life, on what basis could you say that we should not abuse animals? Man, after all, given an evolutionary understanding of his origin, man is just one of the animals as well. And if you look at all the other animals in the animal kingdom, you find out they abuse each other. Indeed, they eat each other. Why shouldn't man then abuse other animals if you are not a Christian in your view of life? Why is man responsible for his environment if you don't take a Christian view of the world and man's responsibility therein? Let's move to the history department. Why should we have history departments if you don't have a Christian view of the world? You know, the ancient world did not produce great works of history, much less philosophies of history. If you think of Plato for a minute, Plato thought that this world in which we live is illusory. He thought that it was less real, in fact, in one sense, not real at all, because it participated in the fluctuating realm of matter. The real world was the transcendent world of ideals, forms, what we'll call universals or concepts, that which is not material. Obviously, with a Platonic outlook, you have no real motivation to study this illusory, less real world of history. The Greek poets and Aristotle all believed that there were arbitrary intrusions into this world. And consequently, since it's a random realm, you don't produce a philosophy or a history pertaining to man's development. The ancient atomists saw the world as bits of matter falling through infinite space. And so there was no telos, there was no meaning, there was just the mechanism of the material world, matter in motion. Again, no basis for history. Where do we get a philosophy of history? We get a philosophy of history once you believe that there's meaning and order or telos, direction. These are metaphors somewhat, but nevertheless, you get a philosophy of history once you think history has some way to be evaluated. It's going somewhere, it has some purpose, or it has some meaning. And in light of your view of the meaning of history, then when you write a history book on whatever, say the War of 1812, then you'll have some standard of importance. Why is it we don't read, when we have books on the War of 1812, why is it we don't read things like how many eggs were available in the market? So somebody says, well, given my view of history, that's not a relevant factor in the War of 1812. But you see, you couldn't select what are the relevant factors if you didn't already have some understanding of the meaning and direction of history, of what it's all about. Standards of importance, standards of historical causality, all assume something more to history than just some kind of mechanical matter in motion. Well, I tried to fly through these other departments just as a way of introducing, finally, the problem that I see in the literature department in our day. It's the problem of deconstruction. I'm going to be focusing on that in my remarks tonight, not because I have a particular prejudice for literature, though it's a great interest of mine, but I think this problem is applicable to all of the academic fields, and the challenge of deconstruction must be surmounted in the history department, in the law department, in the philosophy department, everywhere. Deconstruction is a theory of language that's been influential in most contemporary literary criticism. Deconstructive theory has its greatest audience on American university campuses, and within the university system, it's particularly the literature departments that have been most captivated by its influence. Its originator, Jacques Derrida, is a French philosopher who in many respects is like the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He shares many ideas Derrida does with Nietzsche. Back in 1967, Derrida's well-known lecture, Now Structure, Sign, and Play, in the discourse of the human sciences, kicked off the deconstructionist movement. Derrida is especially enamored of Nietzsche's view of language as rhetorical rather than representational. Language does not represent reality. It is a rhetorical tool for dealing with reality. In this century, the initial center of interest in Derrida was the Yale University English Department, has now become the University of California, Irvine, which is my backyard. American deconstructive criticism has many adherents throughout the country, with the leading works considered to be those of Paul de Man, J. Hillis Miller, and Jonathan Culler. Culler is of interest because in 1975 he was at Cornell University as a structuralist and then converted to Deconstructionism in 1982. Deconstructionism's main contention is that the meaning of a text is not something that can be determined. The very notion that meaning is a property of the text is itself mistaken. It's the mistake of what they call logocentrism. Deconstructors such as Paul de Man recognize that signs without reference, without meaning, make thematic interpretation problematic. And thus rhetorical reading becomes the project of the critic, who must keep in mind a conception of textuality that sees the text as self-destructive and thus impossible to read. The text is self-destructive. De Man moves then to a theory of misreading. In his view, a text is literary only to the extent that it encourages misreadings of itself. When a text is densely rhetorical, it will lead to countless misreadings. Furthermore, de Man posits the idea of valid and invalid misreadings. He is not here making a truth claim on behalf of the critical text, but rather defining a good misreading as one that's an interesting one and leads to further text. The critic or reader is not in error. Misreadings are intrinsic to language, he says, and the other deconstructionists agree. Thus, even the author of a text can only misread his own text. Does it sound rather radical to you? Perhaps the most radical theory of language that we've ever seen, the most skeptical theory of language that I've ever run across, and at least the piece of paper says that's what I'm supposed to be an expert in. Deconstructive theory seeks to subvert the binary structure which it sees as inherent to logocentrism. That is, to show the groundlessness of any view of mimesis, to demonstrate that all language is unable to name the object which it intends, and to expose the absence of a relationship between the signifier and the signified. Language is viewed as a play of differences, which means that there's no such thing as an isolated text. There's just the play of differences. Neither a critic nor a text can be under the subjection of anything that would dominate. Cannot be subjected to the author, to a concept of meaning, to the notion of archetype, or to historical forces. Historical forces are in fact superficial, and thus texts should not be categorized, according to the deconstructionists, as greats of a certain period. There is no canon for a certain period of literary greats, because the greats cannot be differentiated from the lesser texts of the same period, or from the greats of other literary periods. Deconstruction, according to its advocates, is not something added to the text. The deconstructionist says this is the text. The text deconstructs itself, because it is always the story of the problem of reading it. The text is always the story of the problem of reading it. The meaning of a text is not something that can be determined, because if language has no reference, then the very notion of meaning as a property of text is misbegotten, they say. To the degree that the great classics of the Western tradition claim representational and communicative powers, to the degree that they attempt to force a pretended meaning on a reader, to that degree they are tyrannical, according to the deconstructionists. Deconstruction as a method of textual analysis seeks to break free of such tyranny by revealing the incapacity of language to serve any traditional purposes. Deconstruction also says concerning the text that it has no outside. Everything is text. Everything is text in the sense that reality itself is but another form of fiction. And so Derrida rejects logocentrism. All forms of thought which have as a basis an external point of reference, a presence, if you will, some notion of truth, he rejects that. It is a given. It is a presupposition of Derrida's system that no such referent exists. Although words, I'm quoting him, although words suggest the presence of an entity, what they actually mark is its absence, which is really part of the existential analysis of language of Jean-Paul Sartre. A text is not the reality, and so the text is the absence of the reality. It's not the presence of the reality, it's the absence. It is a nothingness then. If we do not find presence in a text, what do we find? That which characterizes the text, according to Derrida, is difference. Now here, difference is spelled A-N-C-E, not E-N-C-E at the end. This is the essence of language. This word is meant to convey both the play of differences that are inherent to language and the fact that because of this play of differences, meaning must forever be deferred. The attempt to determine the meaning of a text results only in interpretation. That is, results in a further text, which requires a further interpretation, and that becomes an endless process. And thus we have what I consider silly works like Barbara Johnson's The Purloined Preface. The Purloined Preface is a deconstruction of Derrida's article in which he was deconstructing Lacan's deconstruction of Poe's text, The Purloined Letter. So you have a deconstruction of a deconstruction of a deconstruction of a deconstruction. Deconstructionists have quite a different agenda from that of traditional critics, obviously, who for generations have attempted to describe, analyze, characterize, interpret, and evaluate individual works of literature or groups of works by one author or within a genre in order to communicate something meaningful about that work or that group of works. Deconstructionists wish to transform entire ways of thinking. The ideal way to bring about such transformation, they feel, would be to banish the established literary canon, which is logocentric anyway, banish it in its entirety, because it only serves to perpetuate the social, sexual, and racial injustices of earlier times. They wish to use deconstructive criticism to challenge the text and to turn it back on itself. And the critic accomplishes this, if I could just be real quick with you, the critic accomplishes this by recognizing the binary hierarchical oppositions within text. Examples of such oppositions would be idea, medium of the idea, male, female, center, margin, objective, subjective, truth, falsity, speech, writing, intention, blindness, signified, signifier, order, anarchy, life, death, origin, abyss, reader, text, certainty, uncertainty. That's just a long list of certain binary combinations. The deconstructionist says we need to banish those binary oppositions. In every case, the left-hand term has been given the superior status, they say, over the right-hand term in logocentric text. An author writes consciously or unconsciously within the logic of logocentrism. The role of the deconstructive critic is a process which seeks the alogical, no longer logocentric, but alogical. It seeks to overturn these oppositions by revealing their undecidability and their duplicity, and thereby undetermine that which is at the heart of logocentrism. Readings in which the left-hand term is displaced by the right-hand term employ what they call hermeneutical violence. Hermeneutical violence brings the joyous affirmation of a world without truth and without origin. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over a quick description of J. Hillis Miller's deconstruction of Milton's Paradise Lost. In essence, what Miller says is, according to Milton, who is this traditionalist and so forth, you have a presentation of Adam and Eve before the fall. They are not then fallen, but then they rebel against God and they become fallen. But then he analyzes a particular portion, a marginal portion of Paradise Lost, where we read of Eve that she had wanton ringlets in her hair, according to Milton, which is obviously a non-moral metaphor. That's the way I would take it. Milton's something of a favorite to me. I think I know what he meant there. But Miller tells me I don't, that by calling them wanton ringlets, Milton contradicted himself, because that would indicate that she was fallen before she actually fell. Deconstructionists consider readings like this to be an engagement by the critic in the free play of language. I would call it free play as well. I'd call it idle chatter, as a matter of fact. Such free play, which has no confines, such as truth or authorial intention, to hem it in, is considered to be a celebration of the loss of the key to interpretation, because such loss has enabled the criticism itself not to mean anything, but simply to be. Criticism can now be shown not to be about anything. Criticism is always about itself. The strength of a reading is not any pretended determination of truth, but the attention which is compelled by the sheer force of the critic's style and personality. Because a critic confronts not a work, but language itself, criticism has no real access to the text and is thus a poetry. It is a fiction. The noted critic René Wellek takes note of the real, quote, blurring of the differences between imaginative literature and criticism in any deconstructive reading. In years past, people would take all of that as very insulting. The blurring of the distinction between imaginative literature and criticism, but that's exactly what deconstructionism seeks. Now, I want to ask you, since English departments and many other departments are fascinated with this deconstructionist approach, from within a non-Christian worldview, can the cogency or intelligibility of deconstruction be granted on the basis of its own premises? One problem that those who would seek to refute the position have discovered is that the deconstructionists often agree with or fully accept the assertions advanced by their opponents. Detractors of deconstruction have accused the position of being anarchistic, arbitrary, capricious, contradictory, parasitic, nihilistic, subjective, and self-deconstructing, just to mention a few problems. Deconstructionists would say that these charges are indeed apropos, but they would consider them merely descriptive of rather than critical of their position. I know this has been a lot to have to digest reading this quickly, but let me put it to you simply. Critic comes to you and says, well, your position is self-contradictory. And you respond, thank you. That's exactly what I was describing. Referring to J. Hillis Miller, David Blaish says, and I quote, what his critics used as a criticism he considers fact about his work. End of quote. This kind of deconstructionist defense that is not allowing any reductio ad absurdum to seem absurd can be useful only when answering what are merely prima facie flaws, though, I think, because this defense proves ultimately lethal to itself. The defense is a willingness to accept inconsistency as legitimate, to accept the deconstruction of deconstructionism. Such premises lead to their own deconstruction since their opposites are as true as the premises of deconstruction. When someone takes the position that inconsistency is permissible, if he is honest, then it is permissible to be inconsistent about that very position itself. When someone says, it's permissible for me to be inconsistent, then of course you may then be inconsistent about the permissibility of his being inconsistent. In short, to allow inconsistency is in the nature of the case to disallow inconsistency. Now, whether Derrida wants to be personally persuaded by such legitimate argumentation is really beside the point. Deconstruction is but the latest, trendy variant of a long-standing, recurring philosophical tradition, that of skepticism. In short, it is the application to text of a skeptical metaphysic, a particularly forceful one in our day, but nevertheless, it's just the old stuff that we've always dealt with in a new garb. And therefore, it's readily refutable because one cannot claim to know that everything is unknowable. One cannot say, I know that we can't know anything. It turns out that within the deconstructionist framework, deconstruction is admittedly not a description of something, nor an argument seeking to prove something else. Given the deconstructionist view, assertions are meaningless without reference, and arguments are impossible without assertions. And therefore, the advocacy of deconstruction as a speech act itself functions at most as a recommendation. Deconstructionists can't argue for their position, they can only recommend their position. Indeed, we're free to choose not to follow that recommendation. Why would we take the recommendation of those who say it is true that there is no truth? Derrida is forced into a situation where he uses statements to signify that statements can have no objective significance. He uses language then like a ladder that leads to nowhere, so that the very ladder must be thrown away itself. A deconstructive critic cannot, by his own rules, tell us why we should continue to do criticism. A truly deconstructive critic would have to cease writing. He should refuse to use language to communicate the meaninglessness of language. To put it briefly, the only honest deconstructionist is a silent deconstructionist. Well, I've given more time to the English department than maybe many of you would have liked. But what I'm getting at is, you see, what the humanist world, with its non-Christian presuppositions, has produced in its honesty today in the English department is a deconstructionism that leads to the silence of man rather than literary products and literary interpretation or communication. We have the death of the English department when we get to deconstruction. Let me make another point about this quick flying through the departments and their problems at the university. It is not simply that non-Christians have been unable to provide a foundation in sociology, political science, psychology, physics, biology, math, philosophy, law, economics, environmental studies, history, or literature. You could take all those departments and more if I had the time tonight. Each one has their problems, but even more, the non-Christian approach to reality and to knowledge and to life has not been able to justify the concept of the university. The university, the university, that place that demonstrates unity and diversity. The diverse examination, learning about different areas of life and man's experience within a unified outlook. There is no worldview that unifies and helps to interpret all of man's experience at the modern university. A worldview is a network of presuppositions in terms of which all of experience is related and interpreted. Worldviews are the crux to all of our thinking, all of our research, all of our ability to make sense out of life. But there is no worldview evident at the modern university. There's a multiplicity of worldviews. Worldviews answer questions like, what is the nature of man? freedom, goodness? Is man but just an animal? What is the nature of the universe? What is its origin? What is the nature of change and development or history? What is the character of concepts, uniformity, universals, and laws? A worldview tells you your theory of knowledge. What is the nature of truth and objectivity? What's the nature of belief or knowledge? What are the standards and procedures that we use for justification? What is the logic of science and discovery? A worldview gives us our ethical perspective, the nature of good and evil, our standards of ethics, our views of man's guilt, personal peace, atonement, social order, our views of the state, and how we should attain and produce moral character and conduct. What I'm getting at is that the modern university has no worldview that can integrate the English department, the history department, the philosophy department, the biology department, the physics department, the math department, the performing arts, or whatever else you may wish to talk about. And so what we have seen in our day and age, where non-Christians have been governing the university, is a disintegration of the university itself. But now let's ask ourselves some questions about what is spawned by the non-Christian worldview that is being taught in so many colleges and universities of our day and age. We've looked at a lot of academic and philosophical problems, but very practically speaking, what does the unbelieving worldview produce for us? What kind of culture do we have because of the unbelieving worldview? First of all, look at our artistic culture. Musical compositions which defy order and harmony and have no sense of resolution. Music departments promote that kind of work. They think that that's perfectly all right. And when you point out people don't enjoy that, then they become disdainful of the masses and pursue a kind of elitist approach to music. Though it may not be considered popular, it nevertheless is music at the cutting edge. Look at our visual arts today, painting and photography, which purposely offend in the name of personal and social liberation. Well, you see, given that approach to the visual arts, why shouldn't we depict the things that Marquis de Sade promoted? Why should the titillation of snuff films be ruled out in art? In fact, what is the boundary between art and non-art? The boundary between beauty and ugliness, given a non-Christian approach to artistic culture. Think about political culture in our day. The non-Christian worldview that we've been talking about isn't just an academic problem. It's produced self-serving politicians who are more concerned with pay raises and pork barrels and re-election priorities than in being wise statesmen who are concerned for the good of the corporate body they represent. But then on a non-Christian worldview, why shouldn't our politicians be selfish? Everybody else is being selfish. Why shouldn't they? Look at the double standards we promote in our political culture. Do you know that Congress does not bind itself to the rules which it imposes on others? Rules about equal opportunity, social security, environmental protection, and the rest. We have men who openly promote double standards who are making laws for us. What are the objective limits to the state and its authority in our day? Are we not living in a day of unprincipled statism when we can violate the jurisdiction of Panama and bring its ruler back because we're unhappy with what he does, and go into Iraq to fight a war which is none of our business? And then on the one hand, we justify going to Iraq because the United Nations condones it, and then when the United Nations condemned our going into Panama, we thumb our nose at the United Nations. This is unprincipled statism that has no sense in jurisdiction or the limits of state authority. We have in our day, in our political culture, a growing state which is doing more and more, and yet we also have growing criminal activity. Now, how can that be, since the state exists to suppress criminal activity? The state is getting bigger, crime is getting greater. I'll tell you how it is. It's because the state is doing more and more of what it's not supposed to be doing and less of its job. Look at our economic culture. Fiat money and a manipulated value on our money characterize the non-Christian approach to economics. What happens when you have fiat money and a manipulated value for your money is that the people who are most in need of economic help and stability, the poor and the aged, are hurt. We have closed shop unions and minimum wage laws that exclude those who need gainful employment and prevent them from competing for it. We have legalized theft through taxation and inflation by our politicians. Our national deficit stands at nearly $4 trillion today. The personal debt has become a way of life for most people. And I'm saying this is what the non-Christian approach to life produces in economic culture. The unprincipled use of the system leads to the savings and loan scandal, which is going to cost us all $72 billion. We have rising unemployment for people who are untrained, poorly educated, and with little self-discipline. Work has become uncompetitive in our country and of apathetic quality. This is what the non-Christian approach to values, how we know what we know and what the nature of reality is, produces. Look at our intellectual culture. Notice the hypocrisy of our leading intellectuals, well documented in Paul Johnson's book, Intellectuals. You should really read it to see the alleged integrity and sensitivity and egalitarianism and altruism of intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell. Men who lived wretched lives, who did not honor women, did not care about children, who were selfish, horrible people, but honored as the intellectuals of our day. Look at our intellectual culture, the cutthroat competition in science and medicine and industry that leads to faked lab reports, tampered studies for the sake of getting money and a reputation rather than finding the truth. Look at a school system littered with unmotivated teachers and schools that are producing increasingly lower scores, higher dropouts, and intense social problems where you have almost a military regime to protect the teachers and fellow students on campus. Violence, drugs, and sex. Look at our sexual and family culture. We live in a day that promotes personal freedom, selfishness, hedonism, so that now more than half of our marriages today end in divorce. More than half. Sexual infidelity has brought personal anguish and pain and despair to people, not the great joy of the sexual revolution. Most children will now experience broken homes in our culture, which brings instability and bitterness to the life of the child. We see an increase in child molestation and abuse in our day and age. 1 million unborn babies are killed yearly, which makes the Holocaust of Hitler look minor in comparison. Promiscuous and perverse sexual lifestyles have brought about an uncontrolled epidemic of AIDS in our culture. What I'm getting at is, when do we finally stop and say there's something wrong? Our physics departments can't account for what they're doing. Our English departments are teaching that no communication is possible. We're promoting a view philosophically and ethically that allows a culture such as our own to have these intellectual and economic and political and artistic and family problems. That's the dirty little secret I was talking about when I started. You see, we all know this. Your professors cannot answer the problems that I've given these various departments. They can just say, well, who really cares? Let's move on to important things. Let's get practical. None of the cultural trends that I've talked about in the last few minutes, none of them stems from or is tolerated by a Christian view of the world and life. The key philosophical problems in every one of the departments of the university and the key social problems that I have mentioned can be answered by the Christian view of reality and the Christian view of how we know what we know and the Christian view of values and how we should live. Unbelievers can only attempt to answer them arbitrarily, can only attempt to answer them inconsistently. Whereas on the other hand, within the Christian worldview, we can make sense of human experience. We can provide the preconditions of intelligibility for doing physics and doing math and studying history and why literature can be great. Unbelievers will not tell you this. Your professors will not want to get into discussions of it. But the dirty little secret is very simply that unbelieving approaches to life cannot provide the intellectual preconditions for any of the departments of the university or the very concept of the university itself. They cannot make sense of the assumed and practiced values, procedures, and judgments in any field of human inquiry, and they cannot save our disintegrating culture. Now, in closing, let me just tell you that as unbelievers hear these things, the tendency will be for them to say, well, but of course you're wrong, Dr. Bahnsen. You say that we can't do physics. You say that we can't do math. You say that we can't do philosophy. You say that we can't do literature. We can't study history. But we're doing it. And we're just going to go right on doing it. And that's why I want to end by pointing out that a person who argues that air does not exist will continue to breathe all the while he is arguing. And yet, if what he said were true, he could not breathe at all. Now, if you point out to him, listen, your theory that air doesn't exist would mean that you couldn't be breathing right now. If he were to turn around and say, well, you must be wrong about that because I'm arguing that air doesn't exist and I am breathing. You'd say, no, my whole point is you're continuing to breathe as a disproof of your theory, because your theory cannot account for what you're doing, continuing to breathe. And that's what I wanted to tell you tonight about unbelievers. I'm not telling you that tomorrow the English department's about to shut down, or the psych department, or the physics department, or what have you. Unbelievers will continue to breathe. They'll continue to do their academic chores. I don't have any doubt about that. But their view of the world would make it impossible to breathe, would make it impossible to pursue literature, pursue history, philosophy, physics, biology, math, or what have you. Unbelieving worldviews cannot make sense out of psychology and math and literature. They would make the university impossible. The idea of a uniform view of life and human experience where every field is related to every other one in a coherent way. And yet the university will continue to breathe. What you have in our day and age is unbelieving philosophers and unbelieving instructors that hide their intellectual poverty from themselves and pretend that they aren't breathing God's air. Because the world is what God made it to be, and because man is God's creature made in his image, men will act in this world in a way that's contrary to their own professed philosophies. They will continue to breathe, act like there's moral absolutes, even though their philosophies say you couldn't be breathing. Christianity offers regularity, abstract concepts, absolute values, and human dignity. That's part of its worldview. Christianity can make sense then of the work of all the departments in the university and can unify the university with a perspective that brings harmony and coherence between all the various fields of inquiry. Paul stood before the philosophers of ancient Greece many years ago. We read of this in Acts 17. And he declared to them that in God they live and move and have their being. And the point that I've wanted to make tonight is that we as Christians maintain that in God, the university, all fields of study, lives and moves and has its being within the truth of what God has shown us about himself in the world and in his word. If what unbelievers say is true, we should all stop breathing. But praise God, he is the atmosphere that makes it possible for the university to continue. Thank you very much. Now, I had promised that I would give a few minutes for questions at the end of this lecture. I also had hoped to make this lecture shorter than it turned out. So I assure you that I won't keep you more than 10 minutes, but having listened so patiently and politely, I owe it to you to respond now if you would like to or ask questions. Okay, for those listening by tape, we have someone playing the devil's advocate. Go ahead. So far, the questioner has told us we can't fight something with nothing. We have to do better than just criticize the deconstructions. Okay, now a cynic could say, if you look at the history of Christian attempts to produce literary criticism, we see serious divergences between schools of thought, a lack of resolution, in fact, not a whole lot of creativity and positive production in our day and age at all. And so though I have said in my lecture tonight, Christianity can save literature and criticism, what do we do with the fact that Christians are not doing a very good job? First of all, we begin by pointing out we have a lot of work to do, and what you have said should be a motivation to any Christian in the study of literature to start regaining the stature of the Miltons of the past that we have really lost. We have given up the field to the enemy. The opponent in that sense. And I think that your criticism is very well taken. Christians have great resources, and they have squandered them. They have not utilized what they are able to do. But now I'm going to go back to my apologetical point, because I agree with you. In fact, I would up the ante to the devil's advocate, and I would say that in almost any field you look at, Christians should be rebuked today because they have not produced the leading works in their field, and yet they are the ones who should be able to do so. Nevertheless, apologetically, there's a great difference between having a worldview wherein a problem can be resolved with diligence, even though the diligence hasn't been applied, and a worldview which precludes the possibility of any resolution. Other comments or questions? I very much appreciate this one. Yes, ma'am. Please speak loud. Well, ma'am, can I politely say, before you go too much further, that's the heart of my philosophy of religion, the very issue that you're bringing up, and I disagree very strongly with you. I do believe that the Christian position is provable. It does not turn in on itself in a subjective faith claim. Although you are certainly right, if you've done any reading in Christian philosophy or religious philosophy, many schools of thought would take the approach that in the end it's something of a mystical experience or a faith commitment, and people cannot talk to each other. But I don't particularly hold to that. I hold to the objectivity of the truth about God, and that is something that's rationally provable. That's right. Not everyone who has claimed to be a communist lived up to the theory that was written out by Karl Marx. It is certainly true that you have adherents of schools of thought that in their practice show themselves to be hypocritical or stupid and dull or not understanding what it is. And I'm not going to, for a minute, especially in this setting, try to pretend that everyone who's professed to be a Christian in the history of thought has done and said things that I could defend. But again, let me point out a difference here. If you take the millions of people that have been executed and abused by godless communism, to take a philosophy, I think that it would be good for us to look at those numbers and put in perspective the number of individuals that have been abused in the name of the Christian religion. Often, just let me finish for a second and we'll get back to you. For instance, one of the things that is a real rhetorical plus for non-Christians that want to make fun of Christian history is to look at the witch trials here in the United States of America, where possibly 19 or 20 people died, and I'm not approving of it, but 19 or 20 people died. And at the same time, in our culture, over 1 million babies are slaughtered every year in abortion. Now, what I'm saying is let's just get a little moral proportionality to these discussions when we talk about them. Secondly, from a philosophical standpoint, let's remember that it's one thing to have a worldview that leads to abuses of people and where you cannot be corrected because the worldview itself condones relativism and abuse. And another thing to have a worldview that would not be followed properly by people and produce abuses, but those people can be condemned by the worldview itself. To put it very simply, I'm not, as an apologist, ashamed of the Christian past that you would bring up, because from my standards of religion, I too would condemn that Christian past that you're referring to. Whereas if I were a relativist or a behaviorist or evolutionist, if I were to bring up all the things that have been done in the hideous name of evolution and naturalism, the naturalist could not say, well, but my theory could correct that. My theory would enable me to criticize them with you. No, that theory is consistent with abuse. And so there is still a great difference, even though you're right that we as Christians have much to be embarrassed by. But go ahead. No, I think it's only relevant to the sincerity of the critic. If you're going to criticize, then you need to criticize across the board and not just pick out Christians when there are these disparities statistically. But you're absolutely right. In principle, if anybody professing the name of Christ has ever murdered another person, that's got to be dealt with. And all I can say is, The Christian theory of life condemns that person, even though that person claimed the name of Christ in what they were doing. Well, I think you can see and probably feel I went plenty overtime just trying to do a whirlwind tour of the various departments of the university. I can't do everything in one lecture, and I think you are right that the completion of this discussion would call for Christians to produce a positive description of their view of life and how people should live in terms of it, how they account for moral perversity within that, and so forth and so on. I will take your criticism to heart. I have not presented the positive side of the story, but I have done this much, I believe. I think I have shown you that people take for granted in the modern university, where Christianity is not the prevailing assumption or presupposition of the various departments of the university itself. People just take for granted that literature makes sense, science makes sense, math makes sense, ethics makes sense, when in fact, if you examine the foundations of these various departments, non-Christian philosophies destroy the department. And I think Christianity provides a foundation for it. One more question. Yes, sir. Okay, for those of you listening by tape, Francis Schaeffer's book, How Should We Then Live, has been suggested as at least an elementary beginning point for understanding that the analysis of culture shows the need for a Christian worldview. And given the disintegration of our values today, Christianity does provide a positive alternative. You've been a very, very cordial audience, and I appreciate very much you inviting me and staying through this long lecture.